They told her it would be a routine session. They told her the chamber was under control. They were lying. What happened inside that European Parliament on that day was not a debate, not a disagreement, not a political dispute. It was a public slaughter. Ursula von der Leyen walked into that chamber as the most powerful woman in Europe. She walked out as a broken, trembling shell of a leader whose career was effectively over before the cameras even stopped rolling. The footage went viral in minutes. The reactions from world leaders were immediate, and the shockwaves from what happened in that single session are still tearing through the foundations of the European Union right now. But here is what the mainstream media is deliberately burying. What happened in that chamber was not spontaneous. It was not emotional. It was calculated, coordinated, and executed with surgical precision by people who had decided behind closed doors weeks earlier that Ursula von der Leyen had to be destroyed, and they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. This is the full story, every brutal detail, every damning revelation. And by the time you reach the end, you will understand exactly why the European Union will never be the same again. The date had been circled on calendars across Brussels for weeks, not publicly, not officially, but in the private offices of senior MEPs, in encrypted messages between political strategists, in quiet conversations held far away from microphones and cameras. The plan had been taking shape. This was not going to be an ordinary parliamentary session. This was going to be an execution. And Ursula von der Leyen had no idea it was coming. She arrived at the European Parliament building in Strasbourg at 9:47 in the morning. Her security details surrounded her as usual. Her senior advisors walked alongside her, reviewing talking points, finalizing prepared remarks, running through the standard procedures of a session they believed would be difficult but manageable. Von der Leyen herself appeared composed. She had survived political attacks before. She had weathered scandals, criticism, and public pressure that would have collapsed lesser politicians. She believed this was another storm she could simply outlast. That belief was about to be shattered completely. The chamber filled to capacity within minutes of the doors opening. Every seat was taken, every gallery packed. Journalists crowded into press areas, cameras positioned for maximum coverage. The atmosphere was not the usual background hum of bureaucratic routine. It was charged, electric, thick with the kind of tension that experienced political observers immediately recognize as the prelude to something historic. Veterans who had sat in that chamber for decades later said they had never felt anything like it. The air itself seemed to carry a warning that something irreversible was about to happen. At exactly 10:09 in the morning, the chamber president called the session to order. The agenda was read aloud. Procedural formalities moved quickly, almost impatiently, as if everyone in the room wanted to get past the formalities and arrive at what they had all actually come to witness. Von der Leyen sat at her designated position, folder open, pen in hand, projecting the image of a leader in complete control of her environment. It was the last time she would project that image for the rest of the day. The first speaker was a German MEP. His name was Noam. His political affiliation was significant. He belonged to the same European People's Party as von der Leyen herself. He was supposed to be an ally. He was supposed to be a defender. When he rose to speak, several of her advisors visibly relaxed, assuming his contribution would be supportive or at worst mildly critical in the diplomatic way that allies criticize each other to maintain appearances. Instead, what came out of his mouth turned the entire chamber to ice. He did not begin with pleasantries. He did not begin with the usual expressions of respect and procedural courtesy that characterize formal parliamentary debate. He began with a single sentence that landed in that chamber like a bomb detonating in slow motion. He said the European Commission under its current leadership had become a monument to failure, arrogance, and institutional decay that was actively destroying everything the European Union was built to protect. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the chamber exploded. Half the room rose to their feet in immediate thunderous applause. The sound was overwhelming, physical, the kind of approval that comes not from political calculation, but from people who have been waiting a long time to hear someone finally say what they have all been thinking. The other half sat frozen, not in disagreement, but in the stunned recognition that something had just shifted permanently, and there was no going back to where things stood 5 minutes ago. Von der Leyen's expression changed in real time on camera. The composure cracked, not dramatically, not with tears or visible panic, but in the subtle, devastating way that real shock registers on a face that is trying desperately to maintain control. Her jaw tightened, her eyes moved quickly around the room, calculating, measuring, searching for allies in the sea of faces surrounding her. What she found instead was the worst thing a leader can discover in a moment of crisis. She found that the room had already decided. Before she even had a chance to speak, before she could mount a defense or offer an explanation, the verdict had already been reached. The German MEP continued. He talked about the catastrophic breakdown in relations with the United States. He talked about how van der Leyen's handling of the transatlantic relationship had managed the near impossible feat of uniting American political figures across party lines in their contempt and dismissal of European leadership. He cited specific meetings that produced nothing, specific communications that went unanswered, specific moments where the most powerful alliance in modern history was treated as an afterthought by a commission president more focused on ideological agendas than on the fundamental security and economic interests of 450 million European citizens. He talked about the energy crisis that had been burning through European households for 2 years. Families in Germany, in Poland, in the Czech Republic were making impossible choices between heating their homes and buying food. Elderly people were dying in cold apartments because energy bills had tripled, while the Commission issued policy papers and held summits that produced nothing tangible, nothing real, nothing that actually helped a single family in a single country survive the winter with dignity. He said these were not statistics. These were human beings abandoned by leadership that had lost all connection to the reality of ordinary European life. Then he delivered the line that every camera in that chamber captured in perfect focus. He said Ursula von der Leyen must resign today, not tomorrow, not after an investigation, not after a review process designed to delay accountability for another 6 months, but today immediately, for the good of Europe, for the survival of the institutions she claimed to serve, and for the basic dignity of the 450 million people whose lives her decisions had damaged beyond measure. The applause that followed was not polite. It was not restrained. It was the sound of a political dam breaking after years of pressure building silently behind it. Before the chamber president could restore order, a French MEP was already on her feet. She did not wait for formal recognition. She simply began speaking, her voice cutting through the noise with the kind of controlled fury that is far more terrifying than raw anger. She had documents in her hand, printed pages covered in highlighted sections and handwritten notes. She had prepared for this moment carefully, and what she had prepared was devastating. She focused on a single issue with laser precision: the complete and total humiliation of European diplomatic standing on the global stage under von der Leyen's watch. She described in specific detail how European delegations had been left waiting in corridors while American officials refused meetings, how formal communications from the Commission had gone unanswered for weeks at a time, how allies that Europe had cultivated for decades through careful, patient diplomacy had publicly dismissed European positions as irrelevant to real geopolitical calculations. She said the transatlantic relationship that had anchored European security since 1945 had been reduced to a diplomatic fiction, a performance of partnership with no substance behind it. And the person responsible for that historic collapse was sitting right there in that chamber, and the time for politeness about that fact was finished. The chamber was now operating at a frequency of collective fury that nobody present had experienced before, and the first section of the parliamentary assault had barely even begun. Because waiting in the seats behind the French MEP was a line of representatives from across the continent, each carrying their own evidence, their own accusations, their own piece of a picture that, when assembled completely, would make it impossible for anyone anywhere to argue that Ursula von der Leyen deserved to remain in her position for a single additional day. The question was not whether she would survive this session. The question, the one that nobody in that chamber dared to say out loud yet, was whether she would be the only one falling when it was all over. The chamber had already passed the point of no return. What began as a coordinated political assault was now transforming into something far more dangerous for Ursula von der Leyen. It was becoming a consensus, not just among her opponents, not just among the skeptics and the longtime critics who had spent years waiting for this moment. It was becoming a consensus among people who had defended her, protected her, and staked their own political reputations on her continued leadership. And when allies start abandoning a leader in public, on camera in front of the entire world. It does not matter how many speeches are prepared or how many talking points are memorized. The collapse becomes inevitable and unstoppable. The Italian MEP who rose next did not speak like a politician. He spoke like a man who had run out of patience entirely. He represented a district in southern Italy where unemployment among young people had crossed 40%, where entire towns were emptying out as the young fled to other countries in search of opportunities that no longer existed at home, where small businesses that had survived wars, recessions, and natural disasters were finally being killed by the slow suffocation of Brussels regulations written by bureaucrats who had never built anything, never employed anyone, never risked their own money on a dream. He said Italian families do not care about digital transition strategies or green taxonomy frameworks. They care about whether their children have a future in the country where they were born. And under the current Commission leadership, the answer to that question had become a devastating and humiliating no. He was followed by a Spanish representative who brought forward something more dangerous than emotion. She brought numbers, specific, verified, publicly available economic data that painted a picture so bleak it silenced even the sections of the chamber that had remained composed through everything that came before. She cited the youth unemployment rate across Southern Europe. She cited the collapse in manufacturing output across 6 member states. She cited the trade deficit figures that showed European economies bleeding value at a rate that economists were now comparing openly to the conditions that preceded the 2008 financial catastrophe. She said these numbers did not appear in van der Leyen's speeches. They did not feature in Commission press releases or annual reports designed to project confidence and competence, but they were real. They were documented, and they represented the actual lived reality of millions of Europeans who were being failed systematically and silently by leadership that had chosen image management over honest governance. Van der Leyen attempted twice during this period to interject. Both attempts failed completely. The first time, the chamber president appeared not to notice her raised hand, a slight so visible and so deliberate that journalists in the press gallery immediately noted it in real time. The second time, she managed to get briefly to her feet before a wave of noise from across the chamber made it impossible for her to establish any kind of platform. She sat back down. Her advisors leaned in close, whispering urgently. Her face had moved beyond the initial shock of the first assault and settled into something worse. It had settled into the expression of someone who understands that the situation is beyond rescue and is now simply enduring what cannot be stopped. The Polish representative delivered what many observers later described as the single most damaging individual contribution of the entire session. He did not focus on economics. He did not focus on diplomacy or energy policy or trade. He focused on something more fundamental and more corrosive than any of those issues. He focused on trust. He stood before the chamber and methodically, calmly, without raising his voice even once, documented a series of specific instances where the Commission under van der Leyen's leadership had made public commitments to member states and then failed to honor them, not due to circumstances beyond their control, not due to external shocks or unpredictable events, but due to deliberate policy reversals made quietly without announcement, without accountability, and without any acknowledgement that promises had been broken and people had been misled. He said, when a leader loses the trust of the people they govern, everything else becomes irrelevant. The speeches become noise. The policies become obstacles. The institution itself becomes a source of resentment rather than unity. And that, he said, looking directly at van der Leyen across the chamber floor, was exactly what had happened to the European Commission on her watch. The economic devastation unfolding beyond the parliament walls was making everything happening inside the chamber feel even more urgent and damning. Markets across Europe had been open for 3 hours by this point, and what was happening on trading floors in Frankfurt, Paris, and Milan was catastrophic. The euro had dropped against the dollar at a pace that triggered automatic circuit breakers in several trading systems. European bank stocks were collapsing. The bond markets of 3 member states were flashing warning signals that analysts were describing in language usually reserved for full-blown sovereign debt crises. Investors were not waiting to see how the parliamentary session concluded. They were already drawing their conclusions and moving their money accordingly. The message from global financial markets was brutally simple. They had lost confidence in European leadership, and they were pricing that loss of confidence in real time, with billions of euros flowing out of European assets every single hour. Inside the Berlamont building, the situation had deteriorated from crisis management into something closer to institutional panic. Senior commission officials who were not present in the chamber were watching the live feed on screens throughout the building. Emergency calls were being made between Brussels and the capitals of major member states. But the responses coming back from those capitals were not the reassurances that van der Leyen's team desperately needed. They were cautious, non-committal, carefully worded statements that communicated one unmistakable message without ever saying it directly. The member states were not going to defend her. They were going to wait and see which way the wind settled and then position themselves accordingly. In European politics, that kind of silence from allies is not neutral. It is a verdict delivered quietly through the back door. The Hungarian and Polish governments had by this point already issued public statements calling for an emergency summit to address what they described as a leadership crisis of historic proportions at the heart of the European Union. Those statements were being picked up by international news agencies and broadcast globally. The story was no longer contained within the walls of the Strasbourg Parliament chamber. It was now a global news event, and the narrative being broadcast to the world was one of institutional collapse, leadership failure, and a European Union fracturing under pressures it could no longer manage or even honestly acknowledge. What nobody in that chamber knew yet was that the most explosive moment of the entire day had not yet arrived. The documents that would transform this political crisis into something potentially criminal were sitting in a leather folder on the desk of a Dutch MEP who had been waiting patiently through every speech, every accusation, and every moment of chaos for precisely the right moment to detonate the final charge. And that moment was now less than 10 minutes away.